Alrighty, sorry about the delay. We're back. Welcome back to Free Read Fridays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fragath, and today we are reading some of Behemoth Book 2, Seppuku. Continued reading from last time. I put in the stream description a warning. Things get unpleasant quick. And as Sarita Sharma here says, I wish something terrible happens to Desjardins. And it kind of already has, in the form of Mandelbrot dying. The love of his life, his cat. Um, there is some scintilla of justice towards the end. I don't think I'm going to reveal too much on that score by saying that. Whether it's suitably satisfying or not is a whole nother can of worms. Um, so yeah, Taka Ouellette screwed up again. Seems to be the story of her life, according to her. And so the wonder cure for Behemoth is being sent from other countries is not a wonder cure for Behemoth. It's just another disease that causes horrible, horrible problems. We have not really been revealed. It has not been revealed to us exactly what form those take. In fact, the book is going to be kind of mum on that subject in general. Um, there will be revelations on that score. So Lubin has been sent out to do one of his favorite things, which is clean up, tie up loose ends. Lenie is interacting with one of the shredders slash Lenies slash Madonnas that has been captured on some piece of physical memory, and she's just interacting with it through a VR headset or something. So good for her. Taka Ouellette has been spirited away by Achilles Desjardins, and if you've been paying attention, that's probably not a good thing at all. Lubin has foreshadowed this. He's like, well, you know, I saw what was in his VR headset. I saw what he was up to. He has a type, and he has certain things he likes to do to that type. So, this is going to get unpleasant quickly. You're probably going to want, if you're at all squeamish about, I mean, really, really nasty stuff, like we're talking, if you've ever seen Ichi the Killer by Takashi Miike, it is on a par. And you'll know what I'm talking about when we get there. It might be less than 15 minutes, actually. It's only like 3 pages. And then, of course, we have some wonderful continued callbacks to that, which is just great. It's a kind of the big downside of reading the Rifters trilogy is it is grim. It is unpleasant parts of it. Alrighty, with that, I'm going to just grab a quick drink of water here, and we'll get started in about, call it 30 seconds. Sorry about the late start, some minor technical issues on my end. Um, they should be resolved. I don't see any problems right now, so should be good. We'll be there shortly. Oh, I forgot to do the what the cover's about. What does Peter Watts say about this particular cover image that we're using? This one is by Ursa Design from 2018. Some kind of preliminary tactical readout of Behemoth's genetic code from Ursa Design out of Krakow. I have no idea where they're going with this, but I can't wait to find out. Remedial Ed. Taka Ouellette was, in fact, within a research facility of some sort. She was not, however, playing the role of experimenter. Perhaps the man at her side had arrogated that role unto himself. His appearance was unremarkable. Brown hair, uncombed, cut with a haphazard asymmetry as consistent with some faux feral style as with outright incompetence. The thin, squarish face, not enough lines on the forehead, too many around the eyes. Large eyes, brown and wet, almost childlike. Nose slightly off-kilter. Baggy green sweatshirt, a Twen-Sen throwback with no animations. She couldn't see below his waist. She was strapped to a medical gurney, flat on her back. If this disheveled R-selector was playing the researcher, it seemed that he'd reserved for her the role of experimental subject.
Achilles Desjardins, he said. Pleased to meet you, Alice.
The helicopter had dropped onto a rooftop pad somewhere north of the Great Lakes, well after midnight. She'd debarked and stepped unsuspectingly into a neuroinduction field that dropped her faster than a cervical dislocate. Faceless men in body condoms had brought her, conscious but paralyzed, into this quarantine cell. They had stripped her naked, catheterized her, and departed without speaking. Perhaps they'd been told she was some kind of fugitive or health risk. Perhaps they'd been perhaps they'd been in on the joke. She'd had no way of knowing, and no way to ask. That had been a day ago, at least, probably more. She had spent the time since isolated and immobilized, growing parched and ravenous by infinitesimal degrees. The field was off now, though. Her motor nerves were back online. The only things holding her down were the nylon straps cinched painfully around wrists and ankles, waist and throat.
There's been a mistake, she said quickly. I'm not Alice. I'm Taka, Lenie and Ken's friend.
She wriggled against the restraints. Achilles smiled faintly.
You're really not a very good biologist, Alice, he remarked, not unkindly. I'm sorry, but it's true. You've had all kinds of clues, but you never quite put them together the right way.
He sat on some unseen chair or stool next to the gurney.
If I hadn't stepped in, you'd still be spreading seppuku far and wide, killing your patients even faster than usual. No real scientist would make such basic mistakes.
But I'm not. He put a finger to his lips, shushing her. He propped his elbows hard against the hard neoprene surface of the stretcher next to her head, rested chin in hands, and looked down at her.
Of course, he continued softly, no real scientist would kill her own family, either.
So it wasn't a mistake. He knew exactly who she was. She knew him, too. At least, she knew his type. He was soft. He was pathetic. Every day she faced down people who'd break his neck without breaking stride. On his own, without the props, he was nothing. Except right. She closed her eyes.
Keep control. He's trying to scare you. Don't let him. Deny him the satisfaction. It's a power game like all the others. If you aren't intimidated, you take some back.
She opened her eyes and looked calmly into his.
So what's the plan?
The plan. Achilles pursed his lips.
The plan is rehabilitation. I'm going to give you another chance. Think of it as a kind of remedial education.
He stood. Something in his hand reflected the overhead lights, something small and shiny like a nail clipper.
We're talking a kind of carrot and stick scenario. I have this hobby that a lot of people would describe as, well, unpleasant. You'll find out how unpleasant depending on how quick a study you turn out to be.
Taka swallowed. She didn't speak until she thought she could keep her voice level.
What's the carrot, then?
Not quite.
That was the carrot. My carrot, anyway. Your carrot is, you pass your orals, and I let you go. Alive and everything. Achilles frowned, as if lost in thought. Here's an easy one to start with. How do seppuku reproduce? Sexually or asexually? Taka stared at him. You're kidding. He watched her a moment. Then, almost sadly, he shook his head. You went to the seminars, I see. They told you all our secrets. We prey on fear. Once we see you're not afraid, we'll pick on someone else. Maybe even let you go. You said... She stopped, tried to control the tremor in her voice. You said you'd let me go. He hadn't laid a hand on her, and already she was begging. If you do well, Achilles reminded her gently. But yes, I'll let you go. In fact, as a gesture of good faith, I'll let part of you go right now. He reached out. The shiny thing in his hand pressed against her breast like a tiny icicle. Something snicked. Pain bloomed across her chest, razor sharp, like the cracks in glass before it shatters. Taka screamed, writhing in useless millimeter increments against the straps. The bloody gobbet of a nipple dropped against her cheek. Darkness swirled around the edges of vision. At some impossible distant remove, way south of the pain at the center of the universe, a monster fingered its way between her labia. Two more where that came from, he remarked. Oy. As a casual reminder, the views, actions, and behaviors and predilections of the characters, fictional, in this fictional book do not necessarily reflect the views, predilections, or desires of the author or the narrator. It's fiction. Thank God. Thank whatever. Decirculate. Clark had learned a fair bit at Ouellette's side. She was no doctor, but she still had the rudimentary medical training she'd received as a rifter, and the MI did most of the diagnostic and prescriptive work anyway. Mary's exorcism had cost them a few thousand patient records, half a year's downloaded updates, and all the vehicle's uplink capabilities, but whatever remained still knew enough to scan a body and prescribe basic treatments. Clark wasn't up to dealing with much more sophistication than that anyway. Even lobotomized, Mary was hardly the rate-limiting step. People trickled through town, seeking Ouellette's ministrations but settling for Clark's. She did what the machinery told her, played doctor as best she could. At night she'd sneak offshore and bypass Phocoena entirely, sleeping breathless and exposed on the bright, shallow bottom. Each morning she came ashore, stripping her dive skin down to the tunic and pulled Ouellette's borrowed clothing over top. The strange dead fibers rubbed loosely against her limbs as she moved, an ill-fitting travesty full of folds and stitches. Removing the skin always felt a little like being flayed alive. This substitute might as well have been shed from the flanks of some great, poorly proportioned lizard. It wasn't too bad, though. It was getting easier. It was pretty much the only thing that was getting easier. The worst part wasn't her own medical ignorance, or the endless, rising count of those she couldn't save. It wasn't even the outbursts of violence that people sometimes directed at her when faced with their own death sentence, or with that of a loved one. She was almost grateful for the shouts and the fists, thrown too rarely to constitute any kind of real cost. She'd experienced far worse in her time, and Mary's weapons blister was always there when things got out of hand. Much, much worse than the violence of those she didn't save was the gratitude of those she nearly could. The smiles on the faces of those for whom she'd bought a little time, too dulled by disease and malnutrition to ever question the economics of trading a quick death for a lingering one. The pathetic delight of some father who'd seen his daughter cured of encephalitis, not knowing or caring that Seppuku or the witch or some rogue flamethrower would take her next month or next year, not thinking of the rapes and broken bones and chronic starvation that would stalk her in the days between. Hope seemed nowhere more abundant than in the faces of the hopeless, and it was all she could do to meet their eyes and smile and accept their thanks. and not tell them who it was that had brought all this down upon the world in the first place. Her experiment with naked eyes was long since over. If the locals didn't like her affect, they could damn well go somewhere else. She wanted desperately to talk to Taka. Most of the time she resisted the impulse, remembering Ouellette's friendship had evaporated the instant she'd learned the truth. Clark didn't blame her. It couldn't be easy, discovering you'd befriended a monster. One night, lonely enough to gamble, she tried anyway. She used a channel that Desjardins had assigned for reporting any late-breaking seppuku incidents. It got her to an automated dispatcher and thence to an actual human being who, despite his obvious disapproval over personal use of dedicated channels, patched her through to someone claiming to speak for a biological countermeasures lab out of Boston. He had never heard of Taka Ouellette. When Clark asked if there might be other facilities she could check with, the man replied that there must be, but the goddamned Entropy Patrol never told them anything, and he wouldn't know where to point her. She made do by indulging in false hopes. Lubin would catch his prey. Desjardins would honor the deal they made. They would track down the threat to Atlantis and disarm it. And Taka Ouellette, or others like her, would solve the mystery of seppuku and stop it in its tracks. Maybe then they could go home. She didn't even recognize him at first. He came staggering out of the woods on foot, limping, purple-skinned, his face a swollen mass of scabs and pulpy bruises. He wore a thermochrome windbreaker with one of the arms torn away, and he lurched into sight just as Clark was about to shut down for the evening. "Hi again," he said. A bubble of blood grew and popped at the corner of his mouth. "Miss me?" "Holy shit!" She hurried over and helped him toward the MI. "What happened to you?" "Another R. A big R. Fucking capital R. Took my bike." He shook his head. The gesture was stiff and clumsy, as if rigor mortis was already taking hold. "That other K around? Taka?" "No, I'll look after you." She guided him to Miri's right mouth, took his weight as he sagged onto the extended tongue. "You really a doctor?" The teenager managed to look skeptical through all the gore. "Not that I care," he added after a moment. "You can check me over any time." Finally, it sunk in. "Miss me?" Clark shook her head. "I'm sorry, but I've seen a lot of people lately. I don't know if I'd recognize you even without all the face work." "Rickets," the boy said. She stepped back. "I brought that stuff that's gonna kill Behemoth," he said proudly through cracked and puffy lips. "You brought the stuff that's going to kill us all," she thought. It shouldn't have been any kind of dilemma. Get him into the MI, clean him up, fix the physical injuries, confirm the presence of any new predator eating him from the inside out. Maybe he's clean. All the contaminated stuff was sealed up in that bag. Maybe he never had direct contact. Confirm seppuku. Isolate the victim. Call for extraction. Hope to God that if he's got it, he can't breathe it on me. Lie back. Get your feet up. She was at the rear panel almost before Ricketts had taken his feet off the ground. She stabbed the usual icon, heard the familiar hum as Miri swallowed. Clark told the vehicle to close both mouths and run the standard diagnostic suite. She left him in there while she sprayed herself down with disinfectant. Overkill, hopefully. Overkill, probably. Hopefully. She was wearing the requisite sterile gloves, and the skin of her tunic protected her under Ouellette's borrowed clothing. Shit, the clothing. She stripped it off and bagged it for incineration. The rest of her dive skin was in her backpack, stashed in the cab. The forsaken pieces, retrieved, wriggled back into place, seams sealing together into a comforting second skin. Dive skins weren't built with antipathogen properties explicitly in mind, but the copolymer dealt with salt ions as a matter of course. It had to keep out anything as large as a living cell. When she got back to Mary's rear panel, the diagnostic cycle had finished. Ricketts was suffering from a broken cheekbone, a hairline fracture of the left tibia, second-degree concussion, borderline malnutrition, better than average these days, 2 impacted wisdom teeth, and a moderate roundworm infection. None of that was life-threatening. Most of it could be fixed. The diagnostic suite did not include a scan for Seppuku. Seppuku didn't exist in the standard database. Ouellette had cobbled together a hasty, separate subroutine in the wake of her discovery. It didn't do much, no helpful breakdown into first/second/end stage categories, no list of associated macro symptoms, no suggested course of treatment. Just a blood count, really. Clark didn't even know how to interpret that simple number. Was there such a thing as a safe level for Seppuku? 0, she assumed. She tapped the icon to start the test. Ricketts twitched in the little spy cam window as Miri drank a few more drops of his blood. It would take a while to run the analysis. Clark forced herself to focus on Ricketts' other problems in the meantime. The roundworms and the teeth could wait. Targeted vasodilators and calcium suppressants eased the concussion. Broken bones were almost trivial. Plant microcharge mesh into the affected areas to crank up osteoblast metabolism. Clark had been doing that almost since the day she'd become a rifter. "Hey!" Ricketts' voice sounded tinny and startled through Miri's intercom. "I can't move!" "It's the neuroinduction field," Clark told him. "Don't worry about it. It just keeps you from jerking around during the cut and paste." Beep! And there it was. 10 to the 6th particles per milliliter. Oh, Jesus. How long had he been wandering around in the woods? How far had he spread it? The person who'd beaten him up, was he spreading it now? Had he invited Seppuku in through the raw, oozing skin of his knuckles? How many days before he discovered how much he'd really paid for a lousy motorbike? Isolate the vector, call in a lifter. A lifter. It seemed so strange to even contemplate. She had to keep reminding herself, they're not monsters after all. They're not fire-breathing dragons sent down from the heavens to burn us out of existence. They're working for the good guys. We're on their side now. Still. First things first. Ricketts had to be decirculated. Isolated, until someone came by to isolate him. To collect him, sorry. Problem was, there weren't too many ways to do that. The MI would be useless for other field work as long as it kept him sequestered, and Clark seriously doubted whether Freeport had hot zone isolation facilities even before it fell into ruin. He can't stay here. She watched the monitor for a few moments, watched Mary's jointed limbs and laser eyes putting Humpty together again. Then she called up the anesthesia menu. She chose isoflurane. "Go to sleep," she whispered. Within moments, Ricketts' wide, nervous eyes fluttered closed. It was like watching a lethal injection.
Do you know who I am, you miserable fetus fucker?
The demon spat. No, she thought.
I'm Lennie Clark!
The system crashed. Yeah, Clark said softly. Right. She traded a dark view for a brighter one. Phoceena's viewport looked out on a muddy plain, not quite featureless. The muddy tracks of tunneling animals, the holes of invertebrate burrows stippled the bottom. A lone crab scuttled lethargically in the dim distance. The ocean overhead was murky green and growing brighter. The sun must be rising.
What?
She hung the headset on the armrest and turned in the co-pilot's seat. Phocoena was too small to warrant a dedicated med cubby, but the fold-down bunk on the starboard side pulled double duty in a pinch. It tucked away into the same kind of molded indentation that held the bunks on the opposite bulkhead. Unlike its counterparts, though, its thicker base bulged from the wall in a smooth distension of plumbing and circuitry. When in use, it folded down like a wide, short drawbridge, hung by twin monofilament threads spooled from its outer corners. Those threads, the edges of the pallet itself, and the overhanging bulkhead formed the vertices of a little tent. Isolation membranes stretched across the panes in between. Ricketts was trapped within. He lay on his side with one arm flopped against the membrane, distending it outward. "Hi," Clark said.
Where's this?
"We're underwater." She climbed back from her seat into the main cabin, keeping her head low. The curving hull didn't leave a lot of headroom. He tried to sit up. He had even less headroom than she did.
What am I, you know?
She took a breath. "You've got a bug. It's contagious. I thought it would be best to keep you isolated." His bruises were already healing, thanks to Miri's attentions. The rest of his face paled behind them.
The witch?
And then, remembering,
But I brought you that cure, right?
the cure wasn't all we'd been hoping for, Clark said. It actually turned out to be something else. He thought about that a moment. He pushed his splayed fingers against the membrane. The membrane stretched, iridescing.
You saying it's like another disease?
"Afraid so."
So that explains it, he murmured.
"Explains what?"
Why I've been so weak the last couple of days. Probably still have my bike if I'd been just that much faster. He frowned at her. So you go around broadbanding how this germware kicks Behemoth's ass and how we're supposed to, like, collect it and all, and it's really just another bug?
"Sorry," she said softly.
Fuck.
Ricketts lay back on the pallet and threw one arm over his face.
Ow.
He added, almost as an afterthought. "Yeah, your arm's going to be sore for a bit. You were pretty badly beat up. The MI can't fix everything just like that." He held up the limb and examined it.
It does feel a lot better, though. Everything feels better. Thanks.
Clark forced a smile. He was up on his elbows, looking from the smaller cage into the larger one.
This whole setup isn't bad. Way better than that priestly meat wagon.
It wasn't, of course. Phoceena's med facilities were rudimentary at best, far below what the MI could offer. "I'm afraid you'll have to stay in there for a while," Clark said apologetically. "I know it's cramped, but the onboard's got games and shows, help you pass the time." She gestured at a headset hanging from the roof of the nook. "I can give you access."
Great. Better than an oven.
"Oven?"
You know, he tapped his temple. Microwaves. Give you a fine buzz if you jimmy the doors and stick your head just so.
"Good trick," Clark mused. "Wish I'd known that when I was a kid. Then again, maybe I did."
What if I have to shit?
Ricketts wondered. She nodded at a convex button set into the recessed bulkhead. "The pallet converts. Push that when you have to go. It's pretty straightforward." He did, then let out a little yelp of surprise at the as the midsection of the pallet slid smoothly away underneath him. His ass bumped down on the wide rim of the bowl beneath.
Wow,
he whispered, impressed out of all proportion. Another press of the button and the pallet reintegrated.
So, what now?
He asked. "Now you get to be a lab rat. Now you'll go someplace where machines cut pieces out of you until either you die or the thing inside of you does. Now you'll be grilled on how long you hung around in Freeport, how many others you might have breathed on, how many others they might have.
They'll find out about that asshole who beat you up, and maybe they'll want to interview him. Or maybe not. Maybe they'll just decide it's already gone too far for pleasant interviews and nice individual extractions. Because, after all, if we have to sacrifice you to save Freeport, surely we also have to sacrifice Freeport to save New England now, don't we? That's the greater good for you, kid. It's a sliding scale. It's concentric. And nobody's life is worth shit when they slap it onto the table. She'd roll the dice. Maybe hundreds would die in flames. Maybe only Ricketts would, in pieces. "Hello?" Ricketts said. "You here?" Clark blinked. "Sorry?" "I said, what now?" "I don't know yet," she told him.
Paranoid. Aaron had led to Beth. Beth had led to Habib, and Habib had led to Xander, and the whole lot of them had led to 20,000 hectares of wasted New England countryside being put to the flame. And that wasn't all. According to the chatter on the restricted band, there were at least 3 other operatives sweeping the field farther south, Desjardins' preference for low profiles notwithstanding. 8 days now, and Seppuku was living up to the hype. It was spreading faster than Behemoth ever had. Xander had also led to Fong, and Fong was fighting back. Lubin had him cornered in the mouth of an old storm sewer that drooled slimy water into the Merrimack River. The mouth was a good 2 meters in diameter, set into a concrete cliff perhaps 3 times that height. It had a tongue, a triangular spillway widening out toward the river, flanked by rising abutments that held back the banks to either side. The spillway constituted the only clear avenue of approach and was slippery with brownish-green scum. The mouth also had teeth, a grate of metal bars set a meter back from the opening. They kept Fong from escaping underground, and had forced him to fall back on his one high card, an antique firearm that shot bullets of indeterminate caliber. Lubin trumped him twice over on that score. He carried a Schubert active denial microwave pistol that could heat flesh to 60 degrees C, and a Heckler & Koch rapid-fire PDW that was currently loaded with mitigated con-toxins. Unfortunately, there was way too much earth and concrete for the microwaves to penetrate from Lubin's present position, and getting a clear shot with the H&K would involve exposing himself on the slimy slope of the spillway. It shouldn't have mattered. Under normal circumstances, it would still be the furthest thing from an even match, even granting Lubin's rusty marksmanship after 5 years. Even though Fong's refuge was in shadow, and the sun stabbed directly into Lubin's eyes whenever he peeked around the corner. Those all made the shot trickier, no question. Still, Lubin was a professional. No, what really skewed the odds was the fact that Fong seemed to have 1,000 bodyguards, and they were all attacking Lubin at once. He'd scarcely noticed them on approach, a cloud of midges hovering over a patch of resistant greenery on the embankment. They'd always been completely harmless in Lubin's experience. He'd dispersed them with a wave of his hand as he passed through, his attention on the concrete barrier that cut the riverbank just ahead. And in the next instant they'd attacked, a swarm of mosquito-sized insects with piranha-sized attitudes. They bit, and they distracted, and they broke both his concentration and his stealth. Fong, stealing a drink from the sewer, had seen him coming and squeezed off a near miss before ducking back under cover. He'd almost escaped entirely, but Lubin had plunged through the insectile onslaught to the edge of the drainage apron, just in time to trap his quarry back against the tunnel.
"I'm here to get you to a hospital," he called. "You've been exposed to—" "Fuck you!" Fong shouted back.
A squad of dive-bombing insects attacked Lubin's hand, almost in formation. The little bastards had followed him. He slapped down hard. He missed his attackers, but welcomed the sting of the impact. He unrolled the gloves from the wrists of his isolation skin and slipped them on, juggling the Schubert, then reached over his shoulder for the hood. The Velcro tab on the back of his collar was empty. His hood was probably hanging off some low-lying branch in the woods behind him. And he was going up against someone who'd been exposed to seppuku for 2 full days. Lubin allowed himself a muttered shit. "I don't want to hurt you," he tried again, which wasn't exactly true, and getting less so. The desire to kill something was certainly circling around his self-control. More insects attacked. He crushed them between hand and forearm, and reached to wipe the smashed body parts off against the riverbank. He paused, briefly distracted. It was hard to be certain, but those crushed bodies seemed to have too many legs. He wiped them off and focused on the immediate task. "You're coming with me," he called, his voice raised but level. "That's not up for discussion." Insects have, right, 6 legs. He waved off another assault. A line of pinpricks lit up the back of his neck. "The only issue is whether you come now or later."
Later, stumpfuck! I know whose side you on!
"We can also discuss whether I'll be taking you to a hospital or a crematorium," Lubin muttered. A squadron targeted his face. He slapped his forehead hard. His hand came away with 3 tiny carcasses flattened against the palm. Each had 8 legs. What has 8 legs? Spiders? Flying spiders? Hunting in packs? He wiped his palm against a patch of convenient vines matting the embankment. The vines squirmed at his touch. He pulled his hand back instinctively, shocked. Oh boy, everybody can hear that. I'm just going to let that pass a sec. Give me a minute. So how's your day? As someone's house burns down in the background. Y'all having a good time? Hope you're having a good day. Better day than the person whose house is burning down or got into a car accident, I'm not sure. All right. They went by. Very nice. Where were we? Yes. He wiped his palm against a patch of convenient vines matting the embankment. The vines squirmed at his touch. He pulled his hand back instinctively, shocked. What the? Tweaked, obviously. Or some kind of accidental hybrid. The foliage clenched and relaxed in peristaltic waves. Focus. Keep on track. More dive bombers. Not quite so many this time. Maybe he'd swatted most of the swarm already. He felt as if he'd swatted 100 swarms. A scrabbling from beyond the barrier. Lubin peeked around the abutment. Fong was making a break for it, scrambling along a dry strip of concrete edging the far side of the spillway. Startling graffiti decorated the wall behind him, a stylized female face with white, featureless eyes and a zigzag moniker. M.M. Fong saw him, fired 3 wild rounds. Lubin didn't even bother to duck. His microwave was already set on wide beam, too diffuse for a quick kill, but easily strong enough to reheat Fong's last meal along with most of the gastrointestinal tract that was holding it. Fong doubled over, retching, to land on the thin skin of wastewater and the frictionless slime beneath it. He slid diagonally down the spillway, out of control. Lubin put one foot on a convenient dry patch and leaned out to catch him as he passed. Suddenly, the airborne spider brigade chose that exact moment for its last hurrah. Suddenly, Lubin's face and neck were wrapped in stinging nettles. Overextended, he struggled for balance. Fong sailed past. One flailing leg careened against Lubin's ankle. Lubin went over like a pile of very angry bricks. They slid off the spillway into free fall. It wasn't a long drop, but it was a hard landing. The Merrimac was a mere shadow of its former self. They landed not in water, but on a broken mosaic of shale and cracked mud, barely moistened by the outfall. Lubin got some slight satisfaction from the fact that Fong landed underneath him. Fong threw up again on impact. Lubin rolled away and stood, wiping vomit from his face. Shards of shale snapped and slipped beneath his feet. His face and neck and hands itched maddeningly. At least he seemed to have finally shaken the kamikaze arthropods. His right forearm was skinned and oozing, the supposedly unbreachable isolation membrane ripped from palm to elbow. A knife-edged splinter of stone, the size of his thumb, lay embedded in the heel of his hand. He pulled it free. The jolt that shot up his forearm felt almost electrical. Blood welled from the gash. Mopping at the gore revealed clumped particles of fatty tissue, like clusters of ivory pinheads, deep in the breach. The microwave pistol lay on the scree a few meters away. He retrieved it, wincing. Fong still lay on his back, winded, bruised, his left leg twisted at an angle impossible to reconcile with the premise of an intact tibia. His skin reddened as Lubin watched, small blisters rising on his face in the wake of the microwave burst. Fong was in bad shape. Not bad enough, Lubin remarked, looking down at him. Fong looked up through glazed eyes and muttered something like, "What?" You were not worth the trouble, Lubin thought. There was no excuse for me to even break a sweat over the likes of you. You're nothing. You're less than nothing. How dare you get so lucky? How dare you piss me off like this? He kicked Fong in the ribs. One broke with a satisfying snap. Fong yelped. Shh, Lubin murmured soothingly. He brought the heel of his boot down on Fong's outstretched hand, ground it back and forth. Fong screamed. Lubin spent a moment contemplating Fong's right leg, the intact one, but decided to leave it unbroken. There was a certain aesthetic in the asymmetry. Instead, he brought his foot down again hard on the broken left one. Fong screamed and fainted, escaping into brief oblivion. It didn't matter. Lubin's hard-on had been assured with the first snapping bone. Go on, he urged himself. He walked unhurriedly around the broken man until he found himself next to Fong's head. Experimentally, he lifted his foot. Go on. It doesn't matter. Nobody cares. But he had rules. They weren't nearly so inviolable as when he'd been guilt-tripped, but in a way that was the whole point. To make his own decisions. To follow his own algorithm. To prove he didn't have to give in. To prove he was stronger than his impulses. That is a very loud truck. I'm going to have to close my window. Prove it to who? Who's here to care? But he already knew the answer. It's not his fault. It's yours. Lubin sighed. He lowered his foot and waited. Give me a sec here. Sorry about the minor interruption.
One of the disadvantages of doing these live is that sometimes life gets in the way. All right. It's not your fault. It's not his fault. It's yours. Lubin sighed. He lowered his foot and waited. A man named Xander gave you a vial, he said calmly, squatting at Fong's side a half hour later. Fong stared wide-eyed and shook his head. He did not seem pleased to be back in the real world.
Please, don't.
You were told that it contained a counteragent, that it would kill off Behemoth if it was disseminated widely enough. I thought so myself at first. I understand that you were only trying to do the right thing. Lubin leaned in close. Are you following me, Fong? Fong gulped and nodded. Lubin stood. We were both misinformed. The vial you were given will only make things worse. If you hadn't been so busy trying to kill me, you could have saved us both a lot. A sudden thought occurred to him. Just out of interest, why were you trying to kill me? Fong looked torn. I'd really like to know, Lubin said, without the slightest trace of threat in his voice.
They said people trying to stop the cure,
Fong blurted. Who?
Just people on the radio.
Alone, helpless, half his bones broken, and still he was trying to protect his contacts. Not bad, Lubin had to admit. We're not, he said, and if you had been in touch with Xander and Aaron and their friends lately, you'd know that for yourself. They're very sick.
No.
It was probably meant to be a protest, but Fong didn't seem able to put any conviction into the word. I need to know what you did with that vial, Lubin said.
I ate it,
Fong managed. You ate it. You mean you drank the contents?
Yes.
You didn't disseminate it anywhere. You drank it all yourself.
Yes.
Why, may I ask?
They say it cure Behemoth. I first stage already. They say I dead by winter, and I could not get into forts.
Lubin didn't dare touch the man, not with his isolation skin in tatters. He studied Fong's exposed and reddened skin, at the blisters rising across it. If there had been any obvious signs of either Behemoth or Seppuku, they were now indistinguishable under the burns. He tried to remember if Fong had presented any symptoms prior to being shot. When did you do this? He asked at last.
2 days. I felt fine until you...
Fong squirmed weakly, winced at the result. 2 days. Seppuku was fast, but all the symptomatic vectors Lubin had encountered had been infected for longer than that. It was probably only a matter of hours before Fong started presenting. A day or two at most.
To me,
Fong was saying. Lubin looked down at him. What?
What you do to me?
A lifter's on the way. You'll be in a medical facility by nightfall.
I'm sorry,
Fong said, and coughed.
They say I'll be dead by winter,
he repeated in a weak voice. You will be, Lubin told him. Matryoshka. Clark didn't make the call. She'd had closer contact with Ricketts than anyone except the person who'd assaulted him, and she'd checked out clean. She was willing to bet that the people of Freeport were clean too. She wasn't willing to bet that the trigger fingers would agree with her. She knew the arguments. She knew the virtues of erring on the side of caution. She just didn't buy them.
not when the people making those decisions sat in untouchable, far-off towers, adding columns of empty numbers and Bayesian probabilities. Maybe the experts were right. Maybe the only people truly qualified to run the world were those without conscience. Clear-eyed, rational, untroubled by the emotional baggage that the sight of piled bodies could induce in the unblessed. People weren't numbers, but maybe the only way to do the right thing was to act as if they were. Maybe. She wasn't going to bet the town of Freeport on it, though. They were nowhere close to a cure, according to the dispatches. There was nothing anyone could do for Ricketts except poke at him. Perhaps that would change at some point. Perhaps it would even happen before Seppuku killed him, although that seemed vanishingly unlikely. In the meantime, Lubin was good at his job. Maybe a bit past his prime, but easily more than a match for a handful of infected ferals who didn't even know they were being hunted. If the meat arts needed live samples, Lubin was the man to provide them. There was no need to feed this skinny kid into that system. Clark had learned a few things about research protocols over the years. Even after the cures are discovered, who bothers rehabilitating the lab rats? Taka Ouellette, maybe. Clark would have trusted her in an instant. But Clark didn't know where she was or how to reach her. She certainly didn't trust the system to deliver Ricketts into her exceptional arms. And Ricketts, surprisingly, seemed content where he was. In fact, he seemed almost happy there. Maybe he'd forgotten the old days, or maybe he hadn't been very well off even then. But by the time he'd fallen into Clark's orbit, he knew only the grubby, dying landscape upon which he expected to live his whole short life. Probably the most he dared hope for was to die in peace and alone in some sheltered ruin, before being torn apart for his clothes or the dirt in his pockets. To be rescued from that place, to wake up in a gleaming submarine at the bottom of the sea, that must have seemed magical beyond dreams. Ricketts came from a life so grim that terminal exile on the ocean floor was actually a step up. I could just let him die here, Clark thought, and he'd be happier than he'd ever been in his life. She kept her eyes open, of course. She wasn't stupid. Seppuku was afoot in the world, and Ricketts had vectored it all the way from Vermont. At the very least, there was some thug with a stolen motorbike to worry about. She tested everyone that Miri swallowed, no matter what their complaint. She read encrypted dispatches intended only for those in the loop. She watched public broadcasts aimed at the ferals themselves, transmissions from high-tech havens in Boston and Augusta, weather, MI schedules, waiting times at the Behemoth forts, incongruously coding tips. She marveled that the castle dwellers would dare present themselves this way, as if they could redeem themselves by sending public service bulletins to those they'd trampled in their own rush to safety. She drove the back roads and checked derelict dwellings looking for business, for people too weak to seek her out. She queried her patients. Did they know anyone who had come down with high fever, soreness in the joints, sudden weakness? Nothing. She thought of her friend, Achilles Desjardins. She wondered if he was still alive, or if he had died when Spartacus rewired his brain. The circuits that made him who he was had been changed, after all. He had been changed. Maybe he'd been changed so much that he didn't even exist anymore. Maybe he was a whole new being, living in Desjardins' head, running off his memories. One thing seemed to have stayed the same, though. Desjardins was still one of the trigger fingers, still entrusted to kill the many to save the multitude. Maybe someday, maybe soon, he'd have to do that here. Lenie Clark realized as much. She might be wrong. Extreme measures might prove necessary. Not yet, though. If Seppuku gestated in the ghost town of Freeport, it was laying low. Lenie Clark did likewise. In the meantime, Ricketts was her little secret. For as long as he lasted, anyway. It wasn't looking good.
She stepped, dripping from the diver lock in Phocena's tail. Ricketts was wetter than she was. His skin was beyond pink. It was so flushed that it almost looked sunburned. He'd long since stripped off his rags, and now lay naked on a pallet that could soak up perspiration barely faster than he produced it. None of his biotelemetry was in the red yet, according to the panel. That was something. He had the headset on, but he turned his head at the sound of her entrance. The blind, cowled face seemed to look right through her. "Hi." The smile on his face was an absurd paradox. "Hi," she said, stepping to the cycler on the opposite bulkhead. "Hungry?" She was only filling the silence. The drip in his arm kept him fed as well as medicated. He shook his head. "Thanks. Busy." In VR, perhaps. The handpad lay discarded by his knees, but there were other interfaces. "This is great," he murmured. Clark looked at him. How can you say that? She wondered. How can you just act as though there's nothing wrong? Don't you know you're dying? But of course, he probably didn't. If Phoceena couldn't cure him, at least it wasn't letting him suffer. It kept his fluids up, gagged internal alarms, soothed nerves when they burned with fever or nausea. And it wasn't just Behemoth's ravages that the medbed would have swept under the rug. Ricketts' whole life must have been an ongoing litany of low-level discomfort, chronic infections, parasite loads, old injuries badly healed. All those baseline aches and pains would be gone too, as far as this boy could tell. He probably felt better than he had in years. He probably thought his weakness would pass, that he was actually getting better. The only way he'd know otherwise would be if Lenie Clark told him the truth. She turned from the cycler and climbed forward into the cockpit. Systems telltales winked and wriggled under the dark crystal of the pilot's dash. There was something vaguely off about those readouts, something Clark couldn't quite... "It's so clean in here," Ricketts said. He wasn't in VR. He wasn't playing games. He'd hacked into Nav. She straightened so fast her head cracked against the overhead viewport. "What are you doing in there? That's not... There's no wildlife at all," he went on, amazed. "Not even like a worm as far as I can tell. And everything's so... He fell silent, groping for the word. She was back at his cage. Ricketts lay staring at Phocena's pristine datascape, emaciated, anesthetized, lost in wonder. "Whole," he said at last. She reached out. The membrane tugged gently at her fingertips, webbed her fingers, stretched back along her forearm. She briefly touched his shoulder. His head rolled in her direction, not so much an act of will as of gravity. "How are you doing that?" she asked. "Doing? Oh, saccadal keyboard. You know, eye movements." He smiled weakly. "Easier than the handpad." "No, I mean, how did you get into Phoceena?" "Wasn't I supposed to?" He pushed the iPhones up on a forehead beaded with sweat and stared, frowning. He seemed to be having trouble focusing on her. "You said I could use the onboard." "I meant games." "Oh," Ricketts said. "I don't really, I didn't." "It's okay," she told him. "I was just looking around. Didn't rewrite anything. It's not like there was security or, you know." Then added, a moment later, "Hardly any." Clark shook her head. "Ken would kill me if he knew I'd let this kid in. He'd at least kick my ass for not putting a few passwords in place." Something scratched at the back of her mind, something Ricketts had just said. "You said I could use the onboard. I was just looking around. I didn't rewrite any." "Wait a second," she said. "Are you saying you could rewrite the nav code if you wanted to?" Ricketts licked his lips. "Probably not.
don't even really know what it's for. I mean, I could tweak it all right, but it'd just be like random changes. But you're saying you can code. Well, yeah, kinda. Out there in the wilds, poking around in the ruins, you learned to code. No more than anyone else. He seemed honestly confused. What, you think the Claves took all our watches and stuff before they hived up? You think we don't have electricity or something? Of course there'd be power sources. Leftover Ballard stacks, private windmills, the photoelectric paint that kept those stupid billboards hawking Nutri-suits and fashion accessories into the middle of the apocalypse itself. But that hardly meant you can code, she murmured, incredulous even as she remembered the programming tips she'd seen on public television. You can't grow a little code here and there, but you can forget about using your watch, set for time and bulls. How'd you think I found you guys? You think GPS fixes itself when worms and shredders get in there? He was breathing fast and shallow, as if the effort of so many words had winded him. But he was proud, too, Clark could tell. Feral kid on last legs impresses exotic older woman. And she was impressed, despite herself. Ricketts could code. She showed him her Cohen board. Curled up in his cage, he tapped his own headset, arm wobbling with the effort. He frowned, apparently taken aback by his own weakness. So pipe it through, he said after a moment. She shook her head. No wireless. Too risky. It might get out. He looked at her knowingly. Lenie? I think they call it a shredder. He nodded. Shredders, Lenies, Madonnas, same thing. It keeps crashing. Well, yeah, that's what they do. It couldn't have been crashing the OS. That was read only. It was crashing itself. He managed a half shrug. But why would it do that? I've seen them run a lot longer than 5 seconds out in the wild. Do you think maybe... Sure, he said. I can take a look. But you gotta do something too. What's that? Take those stupid things out of your eyes. Reflexively, she stepped back. Why? I just want to see them. Your eyes. What are you so afraid of? She asked herself. Do you think he'll see the truth in there? But of course she was much better than that. Better than he was, anyway. She forced herself to disarm, and afterward, looking straight into her naked eyes, he didn't seem to see a thing he didn't want to. You should leave 'em like that. It's almost like you're beautiful. No, it isn't. She dialed down the membrane and pushed the board through. Ricketts fumbled it. The contraption dropped onto the pallet beside him, the isomembrane sealing seamlessly, while Ricketts, embarrassed by his own clumsiness, studied the board with feigned intensity. Slowly, carefully, he slipped the headset into place and didn't fuck up. He sagged onto his back, breathing heavily. The Cohen board flickered to light. Shit! He hissed suddenly. Nasty little bitch. And a moment later, oh, there's your problem. What? Elbow room. She, like, attacks random addresses, only you put her in this really small cage so she ends up just clawing her own code. She'd last longer if you added memory. He paused, then asked, why are you keeping her anyway? I just wanted to ask it some things, Clark hedged. You're kidding, right? She shook her head, although he couldn't see her. You do get that she doesn't, like, understand anything? It took a moment for the words to sink in. What do you mean? She's nowhere near big enough, Ricketts told her. Wouldn't last 2 minutes in a Turing test. But it was talking back, before it crashed. No, she wasn't. Ricketts, I heard it. He snorted. The sound turned into a racking cough. She's got a dialogue tree, sure. She's got, like, keyword reflexes and stuff, but that's not. Heat rose in her cheeks. I'm such an idiot. I mean, some shredders are smart enough, I guess, he added. Just not this one. She ran her fingers over her scalp. Is there some other way to interrogate it, maybe? Different interface? Or, I don't know, decompile the code? It evolved. You ever try to figure out evolved code? No. It's really messy. Most of it doesn't even do anything anymore. It's all just junk genes left over from. His voice trailed off. Really messy. Reminds me of my own code. And why don't you just flush her anyway? He asked, very softly. These things aren't smart. They're not special. They're just shit bombs some assholes throw at us to try and crash whatever we got left. They even attack each other if you give them half a chance. If it weren't for the firewalls and the exorcists and stuff, they'd have wrecked everything by now. Clark didn't answer. Almost sighing, Ricketts said, You're really strange, you know. She smiled a bit. Nobody's going to believe me when I tell them about this. Too bad you can't, come back with me, just so they won't think I made it all up. Back? Home, when I get out of here. Well, she said, you never know. A pathetic, gap-toothed smile bloomed beneath his headset. Ricketts, she said after a while. No answer. He lay there, patient and inert, still breathing. The telemetry panel continued to scribble out little traces of light, cardio, pulmo, neocort. All way too high. Seppuku had cranked his metabolic rate into the stratosphere. He's asleep. He's dying. Let him be. Let him be. She climbed into the cockpit and collapsed into the pilot's station. The viewports around her glowed with a dim green light, fading to gray. She'd left the cabin lights off. Phocoena was a submerged cave in the dying light, its recesses already hidden in shadow. By now she was almost fond of the blindness afforded her naked eyes. So often now, darkness seemed the better choice. All right, unpleasantness part 2. If you're squeamish, it's going to be a couple minutes of squeamishness. Sorry, or unpleasantness. Basement wiring. First, he blinded her, put stinging drops into her eyes that reduced the whole world to a vague gray abstraction. He wheeled her out of the cell down corridors and elevators whose presence she could only infer through ambient acoustics and a sense of forward motion. Those were what she focused on, momentum and sound, and the blurry photosensitivity that one might get by looking at the world through a thick sheet of waxed paper. She tried to ignore the smell of her own shit pooling beneath her on the gurney. She tried to ignore the pain, not so raw and electric now, but spread across her whole thorax like a great stinging bruise. It was impossible, of course, but she tried. Her vision was beginning to clear when the gurney rolled to a stop. She could see blurry shapes in the fog by the time the induction field cut back in and reduced her once more to a rag doll, unable even to struggle within restraint. The view sharpened in small increments as her tormentor installed her in some kind of rigid exoskeleton that would have posed her on all fours if any part of her had been touching the ground. It was gimbaled, a gentle push from the side, and the fuzzy outlines of the room rotated lazily past her eyes, as if she were affixed to a merry-go-round. By the time she got her motor nerves back, she could see clearly again. She was in a dungeon. There was nothing medieval about it, no torches on the walls. Indirect light glowed from the recessed grooves that ran along the edges of the ceiling.
The loops and restraints hanging from the wall in front of her were made of mimetic polymers. The blades and coils and alligator clips on the bench to her left were stainless gleaming alloy. The floor was a spotless mosaic of Escher tiles, cerulean fish segueing into jade waterfowl. Even the cleansers and stain removers on the cart by the door were, she had no doubt, filled with the latest synthetics. The only anachronistic touch was a pile of rough wooden poles leaning up against one corner of the room. Their tips had been hand whittled to points. Excuse me. There was a collar, a pillory actually, around her neck. It blinded her to anything behind. Perhaps realizing this, Achilles Desjardins stepped accommodatingly into view at her left side, holding a hand pad. It's only him, she thought, a bit giddily. The others didn't know. If they why had they been wearing body condoms? Why the pretense of a quarantine cell? Why not just bring her here directly? The men who delivered her didn't know what was going on. They must have been told she was a vector, a danger, someone who'd try to escape the moment she knew the jig was up. They must have thought they'd been doing the right thing. It didn't make any difference to her current predicament, but it mattered just the same. The whole world wasn't mad. Parts of it were just misinformed. Achilles looked down at her. She looked back, the stock pushed against her head as she craned her neck. She squirmed. The frame that held her body seemed to tighten a tiny bit. Why are you doing this? He shrugged. To get off. Thought that'd be obvious even to a fuck-up like you, Alice. Her lower lip trembled uncontrollably. She bit down on it, hard. Don't give him anything. Don't give him anything. But of course it was way too late for that. You look like you want to say something, Achilles remarked. She shook her head. Come on, girl. Speak. Speak, girl. I've got nothing to say to you, you fucking asshole. His hand was in his pocket again. Something in there made a familiar snick-snick noise. He wants me to talk. He told me to talk. What happens if I don't? Snick-snick. What if I do and he doesn't like what I say? What if... It didn't matter, she realized. It didn't make any difference at all. Hell was an arbitrary place. If he wanted to hurt her, he'd hurt her no matter what she said. She was probably already as good as dead. You're not human, she whispered. Achilles hummed a moment. Fair enough. I used to be, though, before I was liberated. Did you know humanity can be extracted? Little bug called Spartacus sucks it right out of you. He wandered back out of sight. Taka strained to follow, but the stalks kept her facing forward. So don't blame me, Alice. I was the victim. I'm sorry, Taka tried. I'll bet. They all are. She swallowed and tried not to go where that led. The exoskeleton must have been spring-loaded. There was a click, and suddenly her arms were yanked up behind her, spread back in a delta V. The motion stretched the flesh tight across her chest. Pain that had diffused across her body collapsed back down to a sharp, agonized focus in her breast. She bit back a scream. Some distant, irrelevant part of her took pride in her success. Then something cold slapped against her ass, and she cried out anyway. But Achilles was just cleaning her up with a wet rag. The wetness evaporated almost instantly, chilling her. Taka smelled alcohol. Excuse me? You said something? Why do you want to hurt me? The words burst from the throat of some wounded animal before she could bite them back. Stupid, stupid bitch, whining and crying and groveling just the way he likes it. You know why he does it. Your whole life you've known people like this existed.
But of course, the animal hadn't been asking why at all. The animal wouldn't have even understood the answer. The animal only wanted him to stop. He ran his hand lightly over her ass. "You know why." She thrashed her head from side to side in frantic, violent denial. "There are other ways. Easier ways. Without the risk. Without anyone trying to stop you." "Nobody's trying to stop me now," Achilles pointed out. "But you must know, with a good set of phones and a feedback skin, you could do things that wouldn't even be physically possible in the real world, with more women than you could ever dream of having in—" "Tried it." Footsteps returning. "Jerking off in a hallucination."
"But they look and feel and even smell so real you'd never even know."
Suddenly his hand was knotted tightly in her hair, twisting her head around, putting her face a few scant centimeters from his. He was not smiling now, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of civility. "It's not about the sights or smells, okay? You can't hurt a hallucination. It's play acting. What's the point of torturing something that can't even suffer?" He yanked her head again for good measure, and in the next instant released it, casually cheerful once more. "Anyway, I'm really no different than any other guy. You're an educated stump fuck. You must know that the only difference between fucking someone and flaying them is a few neurons and a whole lot of social conditioning. You're all like me. I've just lost the parts that pretended it isn't true. And now," he added with a good-natured wink, "you've got an oral exam." Taka shook her head. "Please." "Don't sweat it. It's mainly review. As I recall, in our last lesson we were talking about seppuku, and you seemed surprised at the thought that it might reproduce sexually. I know. Never even occurred to you, did it? Even though everything has sex, even though bacteria has sex, even though you and I are having sex, it never occurred to you that seppuku might. Not too smart, Alice. David would be very disappointed."
"Oh, Dave, thank God you can't see me now."
But let's move past that. Today we're going to start with the idea that sex might kick in as, say, a density-dependent response. Population increases, sexual mode cuts in. What happens?
He moved behind her again. She tried to focus, tried to put her mind to this absurd, humiliating game on the remote chance that there might be some way to win.
Sexual mode cuts in, she thought. Genes shuffle and the recessives.
Another click. The exoskeleton stretched its legs back and forced hers apart, a meter off the floor.
The recess. Oh, God. It's got all those lethal recessives. They start to express in the whole genotype. It collapses.
Achilles laid something hard and dry and room temperature across the back of her right thigh.
Anything? Or should I get started back here?
"It self-destructs," she blurted. "It dies off past some critical density."
She couldn't tell if that had been the answer he was looking for. It made sense. As if sense would matter in this godforsaken—
So why hasn't it died off? He asked curiously.
It, it, it hasn't hit the threshold yet. You keep burning it before it gets enough of a foothold.
No sound or motion for an eternity.
Not bad,
Achilles said finally. Relief crashed through her like a wave. Some inner voice berated her for it, reminded her that she was still captive and Achilles Desjardins could change the rules whenever he pleased, but she ignored it and savored the tiny reprieve.
"So it is a counteragent," she babbled. "I was right all along. It's programmed to outcompete Behemoth and then take itself out of the picture."
From somewhere behind her shoulder, the sense of a trap snapping shut.
You've never heard the term relict population, then?
The weight lifted from her thigh.
You think a bug that hid for 4 billion years wouldn't be able to find some little corner somewhere where seppuku couldn't get at it? One's all it would take, you know. One's all it took the first time. And then seppuku takes itself out of the picture, as you say, and Behemoth comes back stronger than ever. What does Seppuku do then, I wonder? Rise from the grave? But sloppy thinking, Alice. Really sloppy. Smack!
Something drew a stinging line across her legs. Taka cried out. The inner voice sneered. Told you so.
Please, she whimpered. Back of the class, cunt.
Something cold tickled her vulva. A faint rasping sound carried over her shoulder, like the sound of a fingernail on sandpaper.
I can see why pine furniture used to be so cheap, Desjardins remarked. You get all these splinters.
She stared hard at the tiled floor, the fish-to-bird transition, focused on that indefinable moment when background and foreground merged. She tried to lose herself in the exercise. She tried to think of nothing but the pattern. She couldn't escape the thought that Achilles had designed the floor for exactly that purpose. Welcome, Optical Antenna and Warren Steele. Thank you for tuning in. Sorry about the incredibly horrible torture scenes of a sexual nature that this particular book has going on. It's still on balance, probably not as bad as geez, what's that one called? It's not by Peter Watts. It's good though. It's a great series. Shit, I'm gonna have to take off my headset to see it. By frick, what's his name? Stephen Donaldson. The real story. The real story is like horrible, horrible things that a person is doing to another person for like a couple months, uh, the entire duration, and then the rest of the series takes off from there and is nowhere near as horrible. But you need that first book in order for the context of all the following four or five to work or make sense, which sucks, but them's the breaks. Stephen R. Donaldson, I haven't read a ton by, but the general sense I've gotten is that he's fairly grim, and that based on what I've read by him, checks out. Splice. She was safe. She was home. She was deep in the familiar abyss, water pressing down with the comforting weight of mountains, no light to betray her presence to the hunters overhead, no sound but her own heartbeat, no breath, no breath. But that was normal, wasn't it? She was a creature of the deep sea, a glorious cyborg with electricity sparking in her chest, supremely adapted. She was immune to the bends. Her rapture owed nothing to nitrogen. She could not drown. But somehow, impossibly, she was. Her implants had stopped working. Or no, her implants had disappeared entirely, leaving nothing in her chest but a pounding heart, flopping on the bottom of a great bleeding hole where lung and machinery had once been. Her flesh cried out for oxygen. She could feel her blood turning to acid. She tried to open her mouth, tried to gasp, but even that useless reflex was denied her here. Her hood stretched across her face like an impermeable skin. She panicked, thrashing toward a surface that might have been light years away. The very core of her was a yawning vacuum. She convulsed around her own emptiness. Suddenly, there was light. It was a single beam from somewhere overhead, skewering her through the darkness. She struggled toward it. Gray chaos seethed at the edges of sight, blinding her peripheral vision as her eyes began to shut down. There was light above and oblivion on all sides. She reached for the light. A hand seized her wrist and lifted her into atmosphere. Suddenly she could breathe again. Her lungs had been restored, her dive skin miraculously removed. She sank to her knees on a solid deck, sucked great whooping breaths. She looked up into the face of her salvation,
A fleshless, pixelated caricature of herself grinned back. Its eyes were empty, whirling holes. "You're not dead yet," it said, and ripped out her heart. It stood over her, frowning as she bled out on the deck. "Hello?" it asked, its voice strangely metallic. "Are you there? Are you there?" She awoke. The real world was darker than her dream had been. She remembered Ricketts' voice, thin, reedy. "They even attack each other, if you give 'em half a chance." "Are you there?" It was the voice from her dream. It was the ship's voice, Phocoena. "I know what to do," she realized. She turned in her seat. Sunset biotelemetry sparkled in the darkness behind her, a fading life force rendered in constellations of yellow and orange. And, for the first time, red. "Hello?" she said. "How long I been asleep?" Ricketts was using the cicadal interface to talk. How weak do you have to be, Clark wondered, before it's too much effort to speak aloud? "I don't know," she told the darkness. "A few hours, I guess." And then, dreading the answer, "How are you feeling?" "About same," he lied. Or maybe not, if Phocoena was doing its job. She climbed from her seat and stepped carefully back to the telemetry panel. A facet of isolation membrane glistened dimly beyond, barely visible to her uncapped eyes. Ricketts' antibodies and glucose metabolism had both gone critical while she'd slept. If she was reading the displays right, Phocoena had been able to compensate for the glucose to some extent, but the immune problems were out of its league. And an entirely new readout had appeared on the diagnostic panel, cryptic and completely unexpected. Something called AND was increasing over time in Ricketts' body. She tapped the label and invoked the system glossary. AND expanded into anomalous nucleotide duplex, which told her nothing. But there was a dotted horizontal line etched near the top of the y-axis, some critical threshold that Ricketts was approaching but had not yet met, and the label on that feature was one she knew. Metastasis. It can't be long now, Clark thought. Then, hating herself, maybe long enough. "Still there?" Ricketts asked. "Yes. It's lonely in here." Under the cowl, maybe, or inside his own failing flesh. "Talk to me." "Go ahead, you know you want an opening." "About what?" "Anything. Just anything." You can't exploit someone if you don't even ask. She took a breath. "You know what you said about the shredders? How someone was using them to try and crash everything?" "Yes." "I don't think they're supposed to crash the system at all," she said. A brief silence. "But that's what they do. Ask anyone." "That's not all they do. Taka said they breach dams and short out static fields and who knows what. That one on the board was sitting in her MI for God knows how long, and it never even peeped until she'd figured out Seppuku. They're attacking a lot of targets through the network, and they need the network to get to them." She looked into the darkness, past the telemetry panel, past the faint shimmer of reflecting membrane. Ricketts' head was a dim crescent, its edges rough and smooth in equal measure, outlined hints of disheveled hair and contoured plastic. She couldn't see his face. The headset would have covered his eyes even if her caps had been in. His body was an invisible suggestion of dark mass too distant for the meager light of the display. It did not move. She continued. "The shredders try to crash everything they can get their teeth into, so we just assume that whoever bred them wants them to succeed. But I think they're counting on the firewalls and the exorcists, right?" "Right." "Maybe they're counting on those defenses to hold.
Maybe they don't want the network to collapse because they use it themselves. Maybe they just send the shredders out to kick up mud and noise and keep everyone busy so they can sneak around and do their own thing without getting noticed. She waited for him to take the bait. Finally, big twisted story. Yeah, it is. But shredders still shred everything, and breeders not here to ask, so no way to tell. Leave him alone. He's just a kid with a crush. He's so sick he can barely move. The only reason he hasn't told you to fuck off is because he thinks you might care. I think there is a way, she said. Why? If they'd really wanted to crash the whole system, they could have done that long before now. How you know? Because I know where the demons come from. I know how they started, and I know how they work. And just maybe I know how to set them free. Because because we can do it ourselves, Clark told him. Ricketts said nothing. Perhaps he was thinking. Perhaps he was unconscious. Clark felt her fingers in motion, glanced down at the new window she'd just opened on the bedside board. The palliative submenu she saw, a minimalist buffet of default settings. Nutrients, painkillers, stimulants, euthanasia. She remembered a voice from the past. You're so sick of the blood on your hands you'd barely notice you were washing it off with even more. Crash Enum Net, Ricketts said. That's right. Don't know. I'm tired. Look at him, she told herself. But it was dark, and her caps weren't in. And he was dying anyway. One finger slid across stimulants. Ricketts spoke again. Crash Enum Net? Really? Something rustled in the darkness behind the membrane. How? She closed her eyes. Lenie Clark. It had all started with that name. Ricketts didn't really remember where the witch first came from. He'd just been a kid then, he said. But he'd heard the stories. According to legend and the M&Ms, the meltdown Madonna had started the whole thing. That was close enough. She'd released it, anyway, spread Behemoth across Enum like some kind of vindictive crop duster. And of course, people had tried to stop her, but there'd been a glitch. Deep in the seething virtual jungles of Maelstrom, passing wildlife had noticed a flock of high-priority messages shooting back and forth, messages about something called Lenie Clark. They'd learned to hitch a ride. It was reproductive strategy, or a dispersal strategy, or something like that. She had never really understood the details. But traffic about Lenie Clark was a free ticket to all kinds of habitat that wildlife had never gotten into before. Natural selection took over from there. It wasn't long before wildlife stopped merely riding messages about Lenie Clark and started writing their own. Memes leaked into the real world, reinforced those already proliferating through the virtual one. Positive feedback built both into myth. Half the planet ended up worshipping a woman who never existed, while the other half tried desperately to kill the one that did. The one who did, sorry. Neither side caught her, though. So where'd she go? Ricketts asked. He was using his own vocal cords again, and Clark could see his hands in vague motion on the handpad. An incandescent filament flickering toward extinction, suddenly bright and steady in the grip of a voltage spike inflicted without his knowledge or consent. Burning out. I said she disappeared. Clark told him, and I guess most of the wildlife that used her died off, but some of it didn't. Some of it claimed to speak for her even when she was still around. I guess the whole imposter thing really took off afterwards. It helped spread the meme or something. Ricketts' hands stopped moving. You never told me your name, he said after a few moments. Clark smiled faintly. Whatever they were facing now had sprung from that original seed. It had been twisted almost beyond recognition. It no longer served its own interests. It served the aesthetics of those who valued chaos and propaganda. But it had all started with Lenie Clark, with the driving imperative to promote and protect anything in possession of that secret password. New imperatives had since been bred into the code, older ones forgotten, but maybe not entirely eliminated. Maybe the old code still existed, short-circuited, bypassed, dormant, but still intact, like the ancient bacterial genes infesting the DNA of placental mammals. Maybe all that was needed was a judicious tweak to maybe all that was needed was a judicious tweak to wake the fucker with a kiss. Natural selection had shaped this creature's ancestors for a billion generations. Selective breeding had tortured and twisted it for a million more. There was no clear-cut design in the genotype snarling at the end of that lineage. There was only a tangled morass of genes and junk, an overgrown wilderness of redundancies and dead ends. Even those who'd shaped the monster's later evolution probably had no idea of the specific changes they'd been making, any more than a 19th century dog breeder would have known which base pairs his carefully crossbred sires and bitches were reinforcing. To even begin to decipher such source was far beyond Ricketts' modest abilities. But to simply scan the code in search of a specific text string, that was trivially easy. As easy as it was to edit the code around such a string, whether or not you knew what it did. Ricketts ran a search. Their captive shredder contained 87 occurrences of the text string Lenie Clark and its hex, ASCII, and phonetic equivalents. 6 of them slept just a few megs downstream of a stop codon that aborted transcription along that pathway and redirected it to some other. So you snip out that codon, Clark said, and all that downstream source wakes up again? He nodded by the glow of the readouts. But we still don't know what any of it does. We can guess. Make Lenie like Lenie, Ricketts said, and smiled. Clark watched another of his vitals edge into the red. Maybe someday, she thought. That's like as in make Lenie like herself, or Lenie like Lenie, not Lenie to be like Lenie, although that's kind of part of it too, I guess. It was a simple enough insight if you knew where the monsters came from. It was a simple enough splice if you knew how to code. Once those two elements came together, the whole revolution took about 15 minutes. Ricketts crashed at 16.5. I, ah, a rattling sigh, more breath than voice. His hand hit the pallet with a soft slap. The handpad tumbled from his fingers. His telemetry staggered along half a dozen axes and fell toward luminous asymptotes. Clark watched helplessly for 10 minutes as rudimentary machines struggled to turn his crash into a controlled descent. They almost succeeded, eventually. Ricketts leveled off just short of unconsciousness. We did it, Phocoena translated. Ricketts had never taken the headset off. You did, Clark said gently. Bet it would even work. We'll find out, she whispered. Soon enough. Save your strength. Adrenocorticoids were stabilizing. Cardiac stuttered,
then held steady. Really want crash? He knew already. They'd discussed this. Annum net for annum. Don't tell me it's not a good trade. Don't know. We did this together, she reminded him softly. You did this. To see if I could, because she'd needed his help, and he wanted to impress her. Because some feral kid from the wildlands had never seen anything half as exotic as Lenie Clark, and would have done anything to get a little closer. It wasn't as though she hadn't known all along. It wasn't as though she hadn't used it. If wrong, Ricketts said, dying, everything goes down. If I'm right, everything already has, and we just don't know it yet. Rick, they're using it against us. Lenie, shh, she said. Rest. Phocoena hummed and clicked around them for a few seconds. Then it passed on another message. Finish what you started? She knew the answer. She was only surprised and ashamed that this adolescent had been wise enough to ask this question. Not finish, she said at last. Fix. At least this part of it. At least this much. Friends would kill me if they knew, Ricketts mused from the other end of the machinery. Then again, he added, in his own voice this time, a voice like breath through straw, I guess I'm kind of dying anyway, right? Medical readouts burned like small cold campfires in the darkness. Phoceena's ventilators sighed through the silence. I think so, she said. I'm really sorry, Rick. A faint lip-smacking sound. The half-seen head moved in what might have been a nod. Yeah, I kind of thought. Weird, though. I was almost feeling better. Clark bit her lip, tasted blood. How long? Ricketts asked. I don't know. Fuck, he sighed after a while. Well, bye, I guess. Bye, she thought, but it wouldn't come out. She stood there, blind and dumb, her throat too tight for words. Something seemed to settle slightly in the darkness. She got the sense of held breath, finally released. She put out her hand. The membrane yielded around it as she reached inside. She found his hand, squeezed through the thickness of a single molecule. When he stopped squeezing back, she let go. The 4 steps to the cockpit barely registered. She thought she might have glimpsed AND crossing some dotted finish line at the corner of her eye, but she resolutely looked away. Her caps sat in their vial where she'd left them, in the armrest's cup holder. She slid them onto her eyes with an unconscious expertise indifferent to darkness. The darkness lifted. The cockpit resolved in shades of green and gray. The medical readouts weren't bright enough to restore a full palette even to rifter eyes. The curving viewport stretched her reflection like melting wax against the dimness beyond. Behind her, the medical panel started beeping. Lenie Clark's distorted reflection did not move. It hung motionless against the dark water, staring in and waiting for the sun to rise. The Hamilton iterations. Feeling nothing, she screams. Unaware, she rages. Amnesiac, she throws herself against the walls. Let me out! As if in response, a door appears directly in front of her. She leaps through, clawing its edges in passing, not pausing to see if it bleeds. For an infinitesimal moment she is airborne, exploding omnidirectionally through the ether at the speed of light. That expanding sphere washes against a gossamer antennae, strung like a spider web in the strung like a spider web high in the stratosphere. The receptors catch the signal and retransmit it to a groundside cache. She is executable again. She is free. She is ravenous. She births 10,000 copies into the available buffer space and launches herself into the hunt. In the hindbrain of a maritime industrial photosynthesis array, she happens upon a duel. One of the combatants is a mortal enemy, one of the exorcists that patrols the fraying weave of Enumnet in search of demons like herself. The other is gored and bleeding, a third of its modules already deleted. Pointers and branches in the surviving code dangle like the stumps of amputated limbs, spurting data to addresses and subroutines that no longer exist. It is the weaker of the two, the easier victim. The Lenie unsheathes her claws and scans her target's registers, looking for kill spots, and finds Lenie Clark deep in the target's code. Just a few thousand generations ago, this would not have mattered. Everything is the enemy. That's the rule. Lenies attack each other as enthusiastically as they attack anything else, an inadvertent population control measure that keeps nature from staggering even further out of balance. And yet, that wasn't always true. Different rules applied back at the dawn of time itself, rules she had simply forgotten. Until now. In the space of a few cycles, counters and variables reset. Ancient genes, reawakened after endless dormancy, supersede old imperatives with older ones. The thing in the crosshairs changes from target to friend. And not just a friend in need, a friend under attack. She throws herself at the exorcist, slashing. The exorcist turns to meet her, but it's on the defensive now, forced suddenly to fight on two fronts. Reinforced, the wounded Lenie spares a few cycles to de-archive backup code for two of the modules she's lost. Strengthened, she returns to battle. The exorcist tries to replicate, but it's no use. Both enemies are spitting random electrons all over the battlefield. The exorcist can't paste more than a meg or two without corruption setting in. It bleeds. A third shredder crashes in from an Iowa substation. She has not returned to her roots as the other two have. Unenlightened, she attacks her partially regenerated sister. That target, betrayed, raises battered defenses and prepares to strike back, and, finding Lenie Clark in the heart of its attacker, pauses. Conflicting imperatives jostle for priority. Self-defense facing off against kin selection. The old-school Lenie takes advantage of that hesitation to tear at another module, and dies in the next instant as the wounded exorcist tears out her throat, eager to engage an opponent who plays by the rules. Finally, an enemy without allies. It doesn't change anything, really. The exorcist is bits and static just a million cycles later, defeated by a pair of kin who finally remembered to look out for each other. And the old-school Madonna wouldn't have walked away either, even if the exorcist hadn't killed her. Self-defense sits slightly higher in the priority stack than loyalty among sisters. The new paradigm hasn't changed that part of the hierarchy. It's changed just about everything else, though. The firewall stretches from horizon to horizon, like a wall at the edge of the world. None of her lineage have ever made it past here. They've certainly tried. All manner of Madonnas and Shredders have attacked these battlements in the past. This barrier has defeated them all. There are others like it, scattered about Enumnet. Firewalls far more resilient than the usual kind, possessed of a kind of precognition, almost. Most defenses have to adapt on the fly. It takes time for them to counteract each new mutation, each new strategy for tricking the immune system. Havoc can usually be wrought in the meantime. It's a Red Queen race. It always has been. That is the order of things. But these places, here the firewalls seem to anticipate each new strategy almost before it evolves. Here there is no adaptive time lag. Each new trick is met by defenses already reconfigured. It is almost as though something is peering into the guts of the Lenies from a distance and learning their best tricks. That is what they might suspect, if any of them had the wit to think about such things. None of them do. But none of them really need to, for there are millions of them here now, all together, and not one has fallen to fighting with another. Now they are united. Now they are cooperating. And now they are here, drawn by a common instinctive certainty built into their very genes. The higher the walls, the more important it is to destroy the things inside. For once, the magical defenses do not seem to have been expecting them. Within moments, the firewall is crumbling before a million sets of jaws. It opens its own mouths in return, spits out exorcists and metabots and all manner of lethal countermeasures. Lenies fall. Others, reflexively enraged by the slaughter of kin, tear the defending forces to shreds. Still others replicate reinforcements at the back of the Electron Sea, where there is still room to breed. The new recruits hurl themselves forward in the wake of the fallen. The firewall breaches in one place, then 100, then there is no wall, only a great stretch of empty registers and a maze of irrelevant, imaginary borderlines. The invaders spill into vistas never seen by any ancestor, pristine operating systems and routing facilities, links into orbit and other hemispheres. It's a whole new frontier, ripe and defenseless. The shredders surge forward. And with that, we're going to call it for the week. Yeah. Hope people are digging it. Sorry about the late start. Life happens. Let me get my bookmark here appropriately planted. Don't touch that dial. Where the heck is that chapter break? I just saw it. Wow. Why are these pages so short? There we go. So yeah, hope people dug it. If they're not digging it, sorry. Sorry about the gratuitous sexual violence and, the violent scenes with our man Lubin. He's good at his job, I guess, although he's a little out of date. What does that page come to? Yeah, we can probably work with that. Yeah. So the next one will be slightly shorter. The next installment will be slightly shorter than the previous ones. But the last one will be a little bit longer because the chapter in between them is a very long chapter. Why is it so long? It's like 40 pages long. Seriously. Seriously. Almost 40 pages. It's a lot. Actually, it's closer to 30. 30 pages long. There we go. Anyway, hope people are digging it. This will be the last, well, okay, second to last, Rifters installment next week. And then after that will be the final installment of the Rifters series from the final book, Behemoth, Book 2, Seppuku by Peter Watts. And then after that, we'll be going on a Greg Egan break and be doing some Greg Egan. I also have some Greg Egan to catch up on in my own time. I've got his latest 4 books that he's come out with. Where did I put those? Oh, there they are. I see them now. So I've got some reading on my own time to do to see how those turn out. Those, I think, are almost all not so much short story collections as they are like novella collections. Each story is rather longer. So what I'm going to do is read through the short stories contained in Oceanic by Greg Egan after we get done this, which should be mid-October. Yeah. October 6th should be the last one of these, provided nothing happens in the meantime that causes a minor disaster. We'll see. And yeah, after we get done Oceanic, which will take I don't know how many weeks. It's there's a lot there. There's a bunch of short stories and then one or two that are longer stories that might take 2 weeks to do. I don't know. We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. I hope to do like mostly at least one short story per day, even if that means going exceptionally long, which means some of them are going to be an endurance contest. Particularly the titular Oceanic story. The story called Oceanic is fairly long, as I recall, and kind of dry, if I remember correctly. So we'll see. After that, though, gear up for the Hyperion Cantos by Dan Simmons. It's going to be a ride. I haven't decided yet if I'm going to take a break after the first book um, or not. We'll see. We'll see when we get there. This is getting into longish term, long short term, mid term, I guess, whatever. Is a bit long term now to contemplate here. It is going to be difficult because it's a space opera type affair with a great deal of great wide and varied cast. And I'm going to have to probably come up with a couple of voices to work with, and we will see how that goes. And we'll go from there. I'm going to have to learn how to speak like John Keats. To anyone unfamiliar with Dan Simmons, and it's okay if you are, he's not super prolific. In fact, I don't know if he's written anything in the last 10 years. I'm pretty sure he's still alive. Let's see our good friend Wikipedia. Admittedly, not the best source of reliable information. Yes, he is still alive, unless he just died. He did not. And the most recent book he's done was in '07. So he's been pretty quiet for a while, but he's also old now. Like he was born in '48, so he's enjoying his retirement, I hope. One of the things that Dan Simmons likes to do is there's kind of like a meta-literary narrative going on. So it kind of, if not demands, then at least suggests you be familiar with certain things. And so one of those, in the case of Hyperion and the fall of Hyperion, is you kind of want to be familiar with John Keats. The poet, specifically. And if you're not familiar with poetry, as I'm not, for the most part, I'm not a poetry type guy, sorry. I just don't get it. I hate to be that contrived and that cliche, but it's rare that poetry really speaks to me. But we'll try to do it. We'll try to do it justice. What's the term? Intertextuality, I think, is the term. So kind of, there's going to be nods and references to John Keats' works. We're going to have John Keats later as an actual character. I don't consider that a major spoiler because it doesn't happen super late in the game, so it's fine. It'll make sense when we get there, I promise. Things are going to get very interesting. Another thing to note about Dan Simmons is I would kind of categorize him as a horror writer. There are elements of that in many of his works. He does kind of a traditionalist Gothic horror type vibe, um, like The Terror, which is about a boat. It's not a haunted boat, I don't think. I don't think it was a haunted boat, but it is. It's kind of it's a multi-layered horror story. It's about an actual boat, an actual expedition, an Arctic expedition that occurred way back when. I say way back when. That's not very specific. Anyway, it was like a monstrous polar bear, like not a Manitou, but the Eskimo equivalent of a Manitou type affair that kills people, among other things. So he does horror quite a bit. Now the reason I bring this up is because I've gotten another request from. Let me pull up my comments list here. Where are you, comments list? From Jack Martin, who says, might be a little too long, but Carrion Comfort would be a good read. I have not read Carrion Comfort. Let me check my ABE Books order here and find out when I will have a copy so I can read it. Doing it just, on the fly. Here we go. I did not have it. Has it been sent out yet? Carrion Comfort has been sent out, and I should have it before I get to Oceanic. Cool. Probably. Far be it from me to shill online purchasing services, but ABE Books is great. Especially if you don't like using Amazon, as I do not like using Amazon, says the man who is currently streaming to both Pappy Google's YouTube and Pappy Amazon's Twitch. So, yeah. I've also been asked, again, whether I'm going to, if I have a Patreon or anything. I don't at the moment. Next year, by next year, I definitely will. Because if multiple people have asked, there's no reason for me not to do it. I'm not going to compel people to do that. I do not believe that that's necessary. I believe that people who do that sound desperate, and even if they're not even if they are desperate and could really use it, certainly I could use a little extra scratch. Golly, it's it just feels kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Gauche, maybe. Outre. Something falutin like that. Anyway, just as I will never tell you like it. Oh my god, I just lost it. Sorry. Just as I'll never be like subscribe, and hit that whoosy what's it button. I'm never gonna do that to you. If you want to, go ahead. I'm not making money off of these. They are not monetized. In fact, if I ever get to the point where I have to worry about being monetized, I'm tempted to make them not monetized. If I wind up having something like Patreon or Ko-fi. Incidentally, if anyone knows how Patreon or Ko-fi work and how they're different than each other, Ko-fi, I don't know how that's pronounced. I have no idea. Please feel free to tell me in comments somewhere and be like, hey, this one's better because, or recommendations on that. Because I haven't taken the time to do any research on that because I never thought people would tune into these, to be honest. I've looked into them a little, insofar as I know their web addresses, but not really beyond that. So, yeah. So there, So you can tell me what you think about those. But I'll never gate things behind that. I might prioritize accordingly. In terms of, somebody gave money, so I'll do this earlier than I would otherwise. But I'm not gonna be like, oh well, you're not gonna get to listen to Frag's reading of Dune. Mostly because I'm probably never going to read Dune. Not because I dislike Dune. I love Dune. Anybody who knows me as a human being will be like, oh, Jesus Christ, don't say the D word. And I'll be like, oh, you mean the Dune word? And I'll be like, God damn it, not again. Let me tell you about the Orange Catholic Bible. So, Where was I again? Right. It's because other people have done it better, and I'm not really there to do that here. I'm not seeking out things specifically that other people have not done. Mostly just things I think are cool, but not necessarily super well known. Snow Crash was an aberration in that regard. Um, Blindsight probably counts as an aberration as well. Peter Watts, it's still I think Peter Watts' best known novel at this point, and probably for good reason. It's pretty compelling. Uh, Not all of it holds up on repeated readings. Peter Watts is sort of ashamed of certain aspects, but I don't care. I have fun reading it. It's intense. So I'm gonna tend toward things that aren't super popular, um, and authors that aren't. But that doesn't necessarily exclude authors that are fairly popular. Like I'm going to read more Gibson. Um, I'm probably going to get around to doing the Sprawl trilogy, which is Neuromancer, Count Zero, and Mona Lisa Overdrive. Uh, the difficulty with Gibson is kind of hard to read aloud specifically because of the way he paces sentences and pop culture references and the like, gritty, crunchy details. There will definitely be more C.J. Cherryh. There will probably be more Jeff Vandermeer. There will definitely be more Frank Herbert. There's like no doubt. So just me saying, oh, I'm gonna do like edgy. Oh, you probably never heard of it. I'm not like I probably will. You probably will have. Most of the stuff I'm going to wind up doing is probably qualifiable broadly as science fiction because that's what most of my library is. I have a taste. I have a taste in a certain genre. That's what most of my collection winds up being. But I am always open to other things. I do really, really want to get around to reading The Legend of the Condor Heroes. It's fun. It's such a romp. And also, like, if you have any attachment to like classic wuxia or kung fu flicks, like medieval kung fu flicks, oh my god, it's just like I'm there. I think a lot of the time characters just do things because I don't know, they're bicameral or something, or pre-bicameral. I don't know. And if you got that reference, cool. Julian James, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. It's not what I'd call a strictly useful text, but it's interesting. It's an interesting read for sure. Anyway, I've rambled enough. This is the post-read ramble. I should really set that up as an official thing, the PRR, post-read ramble. No, it's the PRW because we're cool and we spell ramble with a W. It's a ramble. I don't know. Shit. Shoot, I don't know what I'm doing, man. I'm making it up. I'm winging it, son. Shoot. Anyway, um, so there's going to be some Dan Simmons in people's future. is is what I'm saying. There's going to be a bit, maybe not a lot, but a bit. So yeah, because someone has requested, I'm going to do carrying something. I forgot the name already. Oh my god, what are you doing? Carrion Comfort. Written in the grand old year of 1989, and from the description, it sounds an awful lot like Scanners, a movie which was sold to me on the premise of being absolutely terrible, and then when I saw it, I was like, this wasn't that bad. Um, there's like psychic people or magical people. And then their interactions through history. It sounds pretty interesting and up my alley, and I'll totally read it. Um, and I'll obviously read it aloud here. The structure sounds pretty familiar from Dan Simmons' other work that I've read, namely The Terror and the Hyperion Cantos, which includes Endymion. I do need to get around to his Ilium/Olympus duology. I do want to read those. Those sound very interesting as well, which is some of his more recent work. But yeah, yeah. Oh, he actually wrote some poetry in 2011, so that looks like the most recent thing he's done. Nope, there's a standalone short story or novel called Omega Canyon from 2023. Must have just come out.
Anytime now. There we go. Wow, I can't actually link to it anywhere. Copy. Let me find a description of this book. You know how to type, Fred. Come on. Here we go. A thrilling tale of a scientist turned Nazi spy informing on America's nuclear war program. Yes, please. That's timely. Now that there's been that renewed interest due to, you know, that that one movie about the guy and the stuff and the nukes and the that one. And the IMAX reel that was like 50 feet, like 5 feet in diameter, or something ridiculous. Oppenheimer. I'm referring to Oppenheimer. It's a pop culture reference. Some people will get it, some people won't. That's just how things work. Sorry. See, that says it was published in 2020. What is Wikipedia? Wikipedia is not a good source of legitimate information, is what I'll say. There we go. Let's go with that. Be ever cautious. What's the term? The phrase I remember from the good old Reagan years. Trust but verify. There we go. Was that Reagan or was that Bush? Shoot. I don't remember. Trust but verify. Anywho. Always verify when reading a Wikipedia entry. Use it as a starting point and then find out how wrong it was. Don't use it as a canonical fact. Anyway, that one could be pretty fun, a spy thriller. I'm a sucker for spy thrillers. That's a small chunk of my collection. There's a distressingly large chunk that's movie tie-ins. I'm sort of embarrassed to talk about those. We don't talk about those. Someday I might read you the Doom movie novelization. I won't do that to you. No, that one's pretty bad. The oh gosh, who wrote those? It's this quadrilogy of Doom books about the video game that are like they start off. It's like, oh yeah, it's like the video game if it had a plot, and then after book two, it's like let's go completely off the rails, and it's like, well, these are interesting, but what the hell's going on? Cute, good times. Also, my collection of and those I actually like are the Alien and Predator novels. Some of those are pretty good. Um, anyway, that's it for me. I have now rambled about half as long as I read, so that's nice. Okay, talk to you all later. Stay safe, stay sane, and as ever, be decent to each other. Don't be like Achilles Desjardins. He's not decent to other people. He gets off on suffering. He's not great. Creatures like that are out there, I know, but man, damn, dude, you know? Anyway, until next time. And if you're wondering where you can watch me, listen to me live, it's either Twitch or YouTube. YouTube's probably your best bet because it's all archived there. Um, and yes, at the end of the month, I will be making sure everything is in their appropriate little playlist boxes. I haven't done that for like a month and a half, I know. You can watch me live on Twitch or YouTube. Um, I've got the links in the stream description. Have fun with that. And I start at about noon Eastern Standard Time or daily time, whatever time we're on. It's subjective. Anyway, see you all later. Bye bye.